Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Root of the Matter. I am your host, Dr. Rachaele Carver, and today I am very honored to have Dr. Elisa Song, who is a holistic pediatrician, probably the most well-known holistic pediatrician in our country. She's got great books and supplements and has really gotten the information out there about how important our microbiome and our immune system is to create health. And where better to start than our youngest population of the children? When we get our kids off on the right foot, their entire lives are just so much easier. You know, you've heard me talk a lot about airway, what I think is the root cause of decay. And so I'm really excited for Dr. Song's perspective on the immune system, on the microbiome, and how we can build that resilience in our kids. So, Dr. Song, welcome. And again, thank you so much for taking time in your busy schedule to come and share your wisdom with us.
Thank you so much. I mean, what an important topic to really talk about oral health and the oral microbiome, because that is just getting talked about now more recently. And I feel like, finally the gut microbiome is here. And so now it's time for the oral microbiome too.
Absolutely. Like we've got to make that connection, right? We're one body for some reason, right? We've cut the head off from the rest of the body. We don't,
Yeah, exactly.
or I guess just the mouth, right? We consider the head part of it, but somehow the mouth and the eyes, right, are different somehow. So as I've been teaching, listeners here that I believe when we're having decay, especially in kids, and I often see a lot in my holistic moms come and they were like, I'm doing the nutrition thing right. I don't, and they're so frustrated because they feel like they're doing things right, yet the kids have all this decay. So I often say, listen, it's not about the brushing, the flossing of fluoride. This is a deeper immune system reaction. Every tooth is its own organ, right? It's the same blood pumping from everywhere. So I kind of see this deep connection between nervous system, digestion system, and immune system. And I think it's kind of like this when we get imbalance in this kind of systems and how they interact is when we tend to have an overgrowth, right, of the pathogenic bacteria. The whole environment in the mouth as well as the gut shifts, right? I mean, it's the same tissue that lines our mouth that's lining the gut. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the microbiome and how our digestion and immune system might be related.
Well, I think the first place to just make sure people are aware of is that when we're talking about the microbiome, we have microbiomes everywhere and they're all unique depending on where they are. So your mouth has its own microbiome, which is of course the very start to your digestive tract. And we're one kind of long hollow tube connected, but the mouth microbiome looks different than the small intestinal microbiome, which looks different than the large intestinal microbiome. And we also have a microbiome around our hearts and our eyeballs, and our brain has its own microbiome. And so understanding that we are not just human cells, but this collection of trillions of microorganisms living in symbiosis. And, I love that you said the word ecosystem, because we really do need to think about our bodies as an ecosystem, allowing microorganisms, human cells, bacterial cells to live in harmony if we have the right combinations. And it's also not just a matter of the microbes that are present. It's the entire ecosystem and that allows these these either flourish or not. And so, just like, if you're thinking about growing a rose garden, you wouldn't just think that the more rose, seeds that you throw into the ground, the healthier your rose garden is going to be. That's actually not the case. It's not about more is better. It's about the right soil that can then nourish the right fit of which roses grow in this ecosystem. So it really is all connected. And for me as a pediatrician, I always go back to the gut microbiome because there's so much evidence now on how a baby's developing gut microbiome from birth, which is impacted by her mother's or his mother's microbiome, even father's microbiome before conception, and of course, how they were born and how they're fed in those early years can really shape how their immune system develops and take a path towards allergy or inflammation versus immune tolerance. And calmly interacting with the world. And the way their gut microbiome develops in those early stages also interacts with their developing brain and can inform how those brain connections are formed and even increase the risk later on if there is disruption to the microbiome early on for things like ADHD and anxiety and mental health concerns, which become a much bigger concern for parents as our kids get older. In the early stages, it's all about their immune health. They're getting sick all the time, and or they have eczema or asthma or allergies are starting. Um, and then as they get older, we start to have more concerns about their focus and their attention and their anxiety and stress levels. In those early stages, the most important category, genus or family of microbes is bifidobacteria for babies at least. And that bifidobacteria helps to train the immune system, helps to train the brain, helps to train their metabolic processes. And of course, there's an intimate crosstalk between the oral microbiome and the gut microbiomes. We need to make sure that all of this is happening in tandem.
Absolutely. And I want to reemphasize kind of what you said about it's not just about the bugs, right? I mean, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, we were all about the probiotics,
That's
probiotics,
right.
probiotics, which is good. But now we're seeing, well, they don't really colonize, right? So what do we need to? Oh, now we need prebiotics, right, and postbiotics because we need to create the environment so those bugs can flourish. So if we're using probiotics, we also want to give them right the food and all of the nutrients
Mhm.
they need to thrive so they can colonize. So I think that's shifted my way of thinking too and treating this early decay. What do you, I mean, for me as a dentist, decay to me is a sign that the microbiome is off. Are there other signs? Because sometimes it decays between the teeth, which you can't see clinically, right? You only see on an x ray, or once it's already so big that it's broken through the enamel. Are there other signs that the microbiome might be off earlier? Because, and even some kids, they don't even go to the dentist till they're 4. Ugh,
Yeah.
they might already have a whole, mouthful because some pediatricians think it's stupid that the ADA says go to the dentist at age 1. My parents say, well, what are you going to do? Well, we're going to make them comfortable in the environment. We're going to
Yes.
educate you, the caregivers, right? That's the most important thing, of how to create this healthy mouth. Tell me about maybe some early signs that the microbiome was off.
Yeah. Well, I would say, for, early on, if we're talking specifically about the oral microbiome, we also have to remember that, your mouth is connected to your sinuses and, it's all part of the same system. And so some signs that there may be something to look at in the oral microbiome would be, if your babies are mouth breathing early on, or if they have bad breath. I mean, babies shouldn't and little kids shouldn't have bad breath. I would say from an immune standpoint, if they're always congested, if their ears always seem full, or they're getting frequent ear infections, if they just tend to have a lot of lymph nodes that are reactive, which can be normal, but then you think, well, what are they reacting to? Because your lymph nodes are part of your immune system. And, in those early stages too, babies, when they're born, they don't really have much tonsil tissue that you can see. But as they get grow and up to about maybe 6, 7 years of life, their tonsils become bigger and bigger and bigger, which is a normal process. And then they start to shrink, shrink, shrink. And most of us as adults who, if we didn't have our tonsils taken out when we were young, you can barely see them, right? Or you should be able to barely see them, right? And so when I see kids with really large tonsils, I also wonder, well, what is going on in their immune system? And that also really, has to do with how their microbiome is interacting with the outside world. If we think about the fact that, up to 80% of our immune cells lies in our gut, we actually have these tonsil-like patches that line our entire GI tract. So we think, oh, our tonsils are here, and a lot of people think that they're useless and they're just kind of extra tissue there. But we have these tonsil-like patches that are called the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, that line our entire GI tract. And that lymphoid tissue along our GI tract interacts with the outside world. As I said before, we're one long hollow tube. So everything we eat, all the air and the toxins that we breathe in, the medications that we're taking in, pass through our gut and interact with those immune cells. And those immune cells decide what our immune system should do with it. And over time, if we're faced with a lot of inflammatory factors or foods that are perhaps the same diet and more inflammatory foods, our immune system eventually starts to react and create simmering inflammation, which can then show up as chronic congestion or ear infections or enlarged tonsils. So, no matter what's going on up here, we still have to look at what's going on in the gut microbiome and how the gut and the immune system are connecting. Kids do tend to get more viral infections early on in life. That's a part of their immune training. We don't want them to never get sick. We'd like them to get measured illnesses and have I use my kind of integrative holistic pediatric tools to help them get better faster without needing, pharmaceutical medications. But if they're getting sick more frequently than maybe their siblings or their peers, and it's taking them a lot longer to recover, that's their gut microbiome not interacting well. We know that the health of the gut microbiome can reduce the frequencies and severities of viral and respiratory infections in kids. And so, if your kids are getting sick all the time, you're like, what's going on? You have to look at their gut microbiome. And then, of course, if they've ever had antibiotics for anything, unfortunately, that was a pretty quick disruptor of not just the gut microbiome, but of course the oral microbiome that's developing. And that imbalance, that shift in the composition of beneficial bacteria versus abnormal pathogenic bacteria is what we call gut dysbiosis and even oral microbiome dysbiosis if you measure that. And that can lead to an increased risk for infections, imbalance, chronic inflammation, perhaps even down the road of autoimmune reactions happening.
Definitely. I mean, I think autoimmunity can start, in childhood, especially if you have the certain, the genetic predispositions, if you don't change the environment and all that. I see it's on both sides of my family. I see my kids have, genetics is only a piece of it, but they don't have great detox enzymes. So and I know when they were little, and I was able to control their diet environment a little bit more, they'd get sick maybe 24 hours and they'd bounce right back. Teenagers with their terrible diets, all of their products that, it doesn't matter what mom says. I find them no matter how many times I try to clean their rooms out, they somehow magically reappear and they're sick a lot longer. Just they have lost a lot of that resilience, and I keep trying to tell them, hey, they think they want to have, children when they're young because I'm so old because I had them when I was 30. I said, well, it's going to take a long time to clean up all those, sprays so you got to kind of really think about that now. But, again, they're teenagers, but that's why, sometimes we feel like we all of a sudden, just got this autoimmune condition when no, that's something that's been building a long, long time because the body is brilliant. It's resilient. It knows how to work properly, but it just reaches that tipping point, right? Where the bucket is full and it overflows and it feels like all of a sudden, right? I have these symptoms like with me, I all of a sudden had eczema after my second daughter was
Mm,
born. I was building, I had acne as a kid. I was on all sorts of antibiotics and Accutane, all this stuff that I really,
yeah.
permanently altered my gut. But I was young enough, had enough stem cells or whatever. Is it wasn't till, I was in with two children, stressful, depleted, that, these symptoms finally, arose. But again, the buildup was happening a lot sooner. So if you suspect, like, I love what you said about the sinuses, the tonsils, right? We see so many kids with enlarged tonsils, and most pediatricians would be like, it's fine. It's fine. I'm like, It's very common, but that doesn't make it normal,
Yep.
right? This is your immune system is saying something. So are you mouth breathing, right? And that's huge for proper development of the nervous system. When we're mouth breathing, we're in sympathetic all the time. And that's just the, fire to allow inflammation to continue. So and the frequent ear infections, huge too. So many kids have the protruded lower jaw, right? And it may not be super obvious, but constant ear infections tell me that there's an airway issue, is too small, right? So
Yep.
they're mouth
Yep.
breathing. We need to, and we have so many great devices now that even in infants, right? The special kinds of pacifiers that help grow the jaw, help promote nasal breathing. We talk about that with breastfeeding all the time. Yes, the breast milk is great, but even more so, that properly develops nasal breathing, swallowing pattern. Like there's so much more benefit than just having the breast milk.
Yeah. Well, I just want to emphasize what you said too about, how autoimmunity really does start sometimes decades before the actual clinical disease presents. I mean, we know this if your doc or your pediatrician checks autoimmune antibodies. I mean, there's a very common, unfortunately, general autoimmune antibody called an ANA or anti-nuclear antibody. And unfortunately, over the decades, there was research that looked at these ANA positive rates in different age groups from the 80s to the 90s, and then again from the 90s to the early 2000s. And the age group with the fastest rise in rates of positive ANA levels were our teenagers, our 12 to 19-year-olds. The rates doubled from the early 80s to the 90s and then tripled. And they didn't have autoimmune disease. I now, for my teenagers, I do like to check their ANA levels at some point. I just want to know, is their immune system holding up a little, little flag saying, pay attention to me? It's like the canary in the coal mine. And instead of, yes, it's alarming to see that, but instead of looking at that with fear, we know that we can reverse that. And to reverse that positive ANA level by supporting your child's gut and immune system connection, optimizing their gut microbiome, and eliminating that ANA antibody is one of the most preventive things you can do. And that's where sometimes, for kids, it's seeing it on paper that makes it a little bit more real, unfortunately. Just like with their blood sugar regulation. I mean, so many teens, I'm going to say I'm sure this is true for adults as well, but I don't do blood work on adults. But just with the easy access to a sugar load that we've never had before, with a Starbucks on every other street corner, and boba teas, and all of these sugar laden drinks that go down so much faster than if you take there's a mocha frappuccino something or other at Starbucks that has 55 grams of added sugar, which is about like 17 teaspoons, I think, of added sugar. Couldn't spoon in that amount of sugar that quickly. I mean, it would take you a while and you'd feel gross after a while. Well, that drink you could probably down in under 5 minutes easily,
Yeah,
right? And so, I see so many teenagers with fasting insulins and fasting blood sugar, not in the outright diabetes range, but way above what would be considered, what would be considered optimal. And so, and that also plays a huge role in what microbes want to live in your body, in your brain, in your mouth, in your gut, which then, of course, as we've said, your microbiome has ripple effects on every system in your body.
absolutely. So we've mentioned a little bit of testing. Let's rewind now and back to the younger kids, right? If they're having this congestion, large tonsils, would you, I mean, you kind of know because you have experience, but maybe if the mom says, well, I want to know for sure, what kind of testing are you doing maybe in the younger age group? And then I'd love to know the teenagers, other things that you liked. You mentioned a couple, but love
Yeah.
to know what kind of testing that you do on the younger kids.
I always start with a stool test, and a gut micro, not just like a stool culture that you can get at a conventional lab, but a functional stool analysis that looks at your gut microbiome composition and also their function. The gold standard is quickly moving to using metagenomic testing, moving away from cultures, moving away from PCR testing, because that just gives a little tiny slice of what's in the microbiome. When we use metagenomics data, we can identify pretty much every single microorganism that actually has been sequenced genetically. And then we can also look at their genes and see, well, what is their functional capacity? Because, for instance, I mentioned bifidobacteria. Bifidobacteria is the most important microbe in the early stages of life, in the first, 1,000 days, that first 3.5 years of life. It's a predominant microbial species. But if they're not producing a short chain fatty acid called acetate, if they don't have those genes, then you may have a lot of them, but they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing? Or, do they have the capacity to make vitamins for you? In fact, our microbes make a lot of our vitamins, like our folate and our B12, or neurotransmitters. Bifidobacterium can make GABA, which is a very calming neurotransmitter. We can see patterns of disruption in an infant's microbiome that is linked with having sleep problems or an increased risk for colic symptoms. So,
Mm.
what parent who has a baby who is not sleeping or is fussy night and day doesn't want to know that answer? Because once we know what the imbalance is, we can correct it. We actually can optimize their microbiome. So I always start with the stool test. And the stool test I use, I mean, full disclosure, I'm chief medical officer for Tiny Health, but Tiny Health is the only microbiome test right now in the market that has reference ranges that are appropriate for babies and children. And it spans the lifespan. So the other beauty of the tiny health testing is even for, let's say for moms, we know our microbiomes shift, depending on our stage in life, premenopause, perimenopause, postmenopause. So all those reference ranges are appropriate. And sometimes with infants, that's all we're doing because it can be challenging to get blood work done. Now, sometimes I do want to get blood work done though. If a baby has really, has pretty severe eczema, then I want to check, some blood tests. If they are getting sick frequently, then I'll check some blood tests. Now, the foundational blood tests, I mean, the core are going to be a complete blood count. I'm looking to make sure they're not anemic. And I'm looking specifically also at the size of their red blood cells to see there's something called an MCV. If it's on the higher side, that tells me, oh, maybe this baby needs, or child or teenager needs more folate or B12. Or if they have very small red blood cells, it typically means they need more iron. So I look at that. So the CBC, and then I look for the most common nutrient deficiencies in kids. So a ferritin, which is your iron stores, a red blood cell zinc. Zinc is especially important for any lining, like your gut lining or your lung lining, if you have, your bronchioles, if you have asthma, your skin barrier, if you have eczema. So RBC zinc, a red blood cell magnesium, and a vitamin D. And now through Quest, you can actually measure an omega check, which is an omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid profile. So those are the most common nutrient insufficiencies or deficiencies that I when I'm getting blood work, those are must, because when you're trying to help a child or a teenager resolve any health issue, they have to be nutritionally sound. I mean, you need to optimize their nutrients. Otherwise, you're just trying to, rebuild on a shaky foundation. So the gut microbiome and nutritional status are the foundations. As they get older, and depending on what else is going on with them, I typically do check a full thyroid panel at some point because your thyroid also is it is probably sensitive to environmental toxins that we're all exposed to. So that's something that early on, if there's an issue with the thyroid or even in teenage years, I want to know because that can affect cognitive development and performance. It can affect your mood. It can affect your sleep, your metabolic health. So that would be the full panel, which includes the thyroid stimulating hormone, free T4, free T3, and reverse T.
Which is important. I just want to interrupt you for a sec because
Yeah,
sometimes most testing, they just test TSH.
that's
And
right.
when we're talking about the microbiome, what's really important is you could have your thyroid normal. However, you may not convert that T4 to T3 because we need, guess what we need? Right? We need the gut microbiome. We need the liver, all that functioning properly. We need to have the proper nutrients, right? To be able to do that conversion. So sometimes if you don't look at those free levels, you're missing a lot of the picture. And I think a lot of thyroid disease can go unnoticed, right? And
For
it's not
sure.
as simple as just giving you the free T3, right? We also do want to do that work on why aren't you converting, right?
Mhm.
So this is why understanding these nutrients and trying to get that balance is so important. So sorry, I just
Yeah.
want to make that
No, so
point.
important because it is true. So what I'm talking about is, and what we're discussing is really what labs we want to get from that functional medicine standpoint, and also, what are the optimal lab values? For instance, for when kids are, I mean, even in middle school, but for sure in high school, I like to get the labs fasting, which is harder as, for a baby, little kid, a fasting lab order can be really hard. Because your baby's kids can wake up hangry and you're like, there's no way I'm going to go to the lab, without having fed them. But when they're older, they have a little more reserve on their body. And so then I do like to check a fasting glucose, which is usually part of my comprehensive metabolic panel, which looks at kidney function and liver function as well, with a fasting insulin and a hemoglobin A1C. Now, hemoglobin A1C is your average blood sugar, over the past however, month. It's your average. So when you have kids who are having, a lot of high blood sugars and then a lot of crashes, the average can look perfect. And I rarely have a child until they're later on in their teenage years, have elevated hemoglobin A1Cs. So, but I get that, just to get that. But what usually is more telling is their fasting insulin, which is not common practice in conventional pediatrics. Now, a fasting insulin tells you, well, how hard is your pancreas working to release insulin, even overnight when your child hasn't had anything to eat, to keep their blood sugar stable and normal. And that fasting insulin overnight, when your body is not exposed to any outright sugar that you've eaten, should be 5 or under. Nor the normal range, on a conventional lab is considered under 18. I have so many kids who are at a 15 or a 17, and sometimes even outright. I have one child who was at I think a 36 and, very high fasting insulin. So their body, because their blood sugar is, because their body feels like their blood sugar is high all the time, their pancreas is working overtime. So they're not technically considered diabetes, right? And I have referred that one kiddo with the high fasting insulin, and I repeated it to make sure it was accurate, sent them to the pediatric endocrinologist and said, well, your hemoglobin A1C is fine. Your fasting glucose is fine. So there's no problem. Well, there is a problem. Your pancreas is saying there's a problem. And if we wait too long, then your child will develop outright or can develop outright type 2 diabetes. So this is all about seeing those signs to say, well, how can we course correct before there's a problem? So I do like to check that. I'll check a fasting, lipid panel, which is an interesting one because, we're so, ingrained in the conventional world. Cholesterol is bad for you. Well, cholesterol is essential for brain development. It's also essential for sex hormones. And so I am looking for, all right, if it's really high, then I look twice. But for a child, I want their cholesterol to be over 130. I mean, I've even my adult functional medicine doctor friends, they also say, like, even for adults, for cognitive performance, over 130 is ideal. But I see a lot of kids, especially with any neurodevelopmental concerns, whether, they're on the autism spectrum or, with ADHD, their cholesterol levels might be, 90, or to me, way too low. There is no too low number
Yeah.
on the conventional test. You just see like over 200 is considered abnormal. But to me, that's way too low because we know how important for the brain cholesterol is. And then, if they have those big tonsils, I do want to do my due diligence and check a respiratory environmental allergy panel and a food allergy panel just to see, are there, dust mite allergies that are contributing? What are some of the things that are contributing that we may not be aware of unless we test?
It's so important, and I love that point. I'm always trying to drive that home too about cholesterol. Like, it lines every cell in our body. We need to have,
Mhm.
in order to bring nutrients in and to get the toxins out, right? We have to have that healthy cell membrane. So it's interesting to note that the neurologic stuff, yeah, they don't have enough cholesterol. That's why, one of the main side effects of statin drugs, right, is dementia. Where, like, that's, it just goes hand in hand. So, and we
Yeah.
know the studies prove that the higher your cholesterol is, as an older individual, they tend to live longer. We need to kind of, it's slowly getting out there, even though the
Yeah.
evidence has been there for
Slowly. Like,
decades.
yeah, eggs are not evil.
No, eat some butter. It's okay, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the polyunsaturated fats that become, rancid from processing, right? Those are the problematic ones, which, when it was told to us back in the 70s, right, that fat was bad, that's what happened, right? And that's why, like you said, you saw the tripling of the autoantibodies and all that going up because the diet just changed so radically. And we're seeing, so I love what you're saying that, we tend to think of some of these illnesses as childhood illnesses and no big deal, whatever. But
No.
like you said, we're setting the stage for adult health and
Yes.
wellness. And so it's important to note these things early. And it can be challenging, right? My younger daughter, she is petrified. When she was 1, she ran these really, really high fevers. And they drew her blood every single day. And her neutrophils went down to 0 by the end of the week. So they sent us to the cancer clinic.
My gosh.
It was so scary. By Monday, she had totally rebounded to normal. So they're like, well, I don't know. But so now to this day, she has PTSD from being stuck with needles at such a young age. So sometimes it can be hard to get some of that blood work. And even with my kids, the stool testing, sometimes I'll do an organic acid test because it's urine. At least for my kids, that's been a little bit easier to get them because we can see kind of what's going on in their
Yeah,
metabolism.
I love urine organic acid testing because it gives such a, and that is something that, for children, younger children, if there is a needle phobia or, hesitation around blood work, the organic acid test can give a really good snapshot of nutritional status. There are gut microbiome markers there. There's detoxification markers and mitochondrial markers. So even, a B vitamin and methylation and markers. And so it is a good snapshot. I tell parents and kids, it can help guide, but I don't know if, I can't tell if you're, how much supplementation you might need. Cause sometimes it's surprising how low kids are in their zinc levels or
Mhm.
their vitamin D levels and so that can be one thing. The tiny health test is actually, I think, an easier sell for poop test because once kids get older, I mean, they don't want anything to do with poop, right? And it's easy when they're in diapers.
Yes, yes.
But the tiny health test, it's a Q-tip swab. So if there's, I mean, I tell kids, look, this sounds gross, but if you ever have any poop on the toilet paper when you're wiping, you literally can just swab that and then you send it off, right? Because we all have to wipe our bottoms when we poop.
It's
So it's just one extra step with the Q-tip. And so that's one thing. And then with the blood test, I mean, in my book, I give tips on how to make the blood draw a better experience. I mean, in the case of your daughter, I mean, in the ER, sadly, back then too, there wasn't really much thought to how do we make it more comfortable for kids. Now, in some hospitals, not enough, but some, they have the numbing that right away that goes in, and then they have some amazing like nurses and even child life specialists that come in and try to make it less traumatic experience, right? But barring that, you can get prescription numbing creams so that your child doesn't feel the poke. You just make it as comfortable as possible. And then I think a lot of it is, I'll be totally honest, it's parents, right? Like when my babies were little and I had to get blood work done for my son, and even for me, I had the numbing cream on, and this was like he got a free pass with Dora, on my phone, but even still, I was like, oh, so little, right?
yeah.
So it's also us. We just have to, okay, this is going to be such great detective work.
Well, that brings me to a really important point, which I've seen now over 20 years of working with, kids and parents that again, a big part of digestion and vagus nerve, I think, is nervous system, right? And until age 6 or 7, right, the kids' brains are on this frequency where they're so, I don't know what's the right word there, that environment is is so influential on them. And so a mother's nervous system, like you just said, fear, right? That a child can really feel that. And I think in my own case, I think I did this with my kids when I was learning all this stuff, because I went through traditional conventional dentistry and it was only through my bad eczema that I got into this holistic and saw, then it was like, oh my God, we can't eat wheat, and everything was with this fearful,
Yes.
energy. And so, of course they were like, "Ah, she's nuts, and they were crazy about it. And they were feeding off of of my energy. So something I try to tell moms, and it's not a judgmental thing. I mean, I was that mom, right? And we're always, I mean, as mama bears, right? We are want to protect our kids, but it's interesting if we can recognize our fear and turn it into more of a, compassionate, understanding, educating way. We're going to help our child's nervous system improve, right? Which then improves digestion, which improves the immune system. So I think that's, you know, again, a really important point that I'm always trying to drive home, because sometimes, I know myself, I got in the cycle of, oh, just more supplements and more supplements and more supplements. And, I was causing more emotional stress that, that you get kind of caught on that hamster wheel, right? So,
Yeah. I mean, and your point about the diet. I mean, I opened up my practice is like 22 years ago now. And so, things I mean, a lot has changed and then still not enough, but some things have changed, that I learned back then. I realized it was a little bit too dogmatic, right? You go from this conventional world to this root cause, functional, integrative world. And it's like, the world opens up and you see this huge possibility of, reversing chronic disease in kids, preventing chronic disease. And it's amazing, right? And yet then it still can become a little too dogmatic in the, okay, here's the mile long supplement list. And, here's the elimination diet of the 20 foods that you can't eat because your food sensitivity test said you were sensitive. And that means that, you can't have these for 3 months minimum. And I would write out these complicated rotation diets where every 4 days was a different food. And I mean, I look back now and I think, okay, I was doing my best. And yet for some families, the elimination part of it became more stressful and frankly, probably more inflammatory than the original thing itself. And so, I mean, there are foods like gluten, that are so inflammatory for if you're having an immune issue, especially autoimmune, that it really should be eliminated 100% for a period of time while you're healing your gut and healing your immune system. But just like most things in life, there are very few absolutes, you know, and there has to be, now that there's so much more awareness of, the vagus nerve and, the importance of optimal heart rate variability and, the power of really your autonomic nervous system to shape your epigenetics. It's so important to make sure that we step back and make things doable and also like fun, right? Just having some joy in it, some being very hopeful. I mean, just being that cheerleader for your patients or as a parent, like being that cheerleader for your kids. And, if they have a little slip up, okay, it's not the end of the world. We're going to, every bite is an opportunity for, the next choice, right? And so it really, I think that has shifted quite a bit. I used to be much more absolute about, oh, you have to be 100% strict, right?
yeah, I used to think, how come? Because I was like, oh, yes, gluten is a big problem for me, but I'd go on vacation and eat whatever I want and my eczema would clear. And so I was like,
Yeah.
it can't
Yep.
just be about the food, right? I'm like, so really interesting. And once I healed my gut, I can eat wheat again. I still do it kind of sparingly and try to do the organic, but don't get the eczema anymore from that because I've, done a lot of work of healing the gut, healing the nervous system and all that. So we're kind of winding down here. I want to be respectful of your time. So maybe tell us, and again, we know every single child, every single person is an individual. So there aren't really any hard, fast, like absolute rules. But in general, for a healthy child, what do you think, because our diet and the food supply is so lacking in minerals specifically, do you think there are certain supplements that most children should take?
That's a tough one. I would say, I mean, unfortunately, yes, just because, as you said, I mean, even for families that come to me and they are eating really clean and, have varied diets, and you think, okay, of any child, this child probably is nutritionally fine. And then when I do blood work, I mean, more often than not, there are nutritional insufficiencies or deficiencies, even for our healthiest eaters. It's just it's not just the food we're eating that is less nutrient dense. It's also that the world now is demanding more of our kids from a detoxification standpoint, from an immune standpoint, from a brain standpoint. So they actually need more nutrients too than often they're getting in. And so I think almost all kids are going to need some extra vitamin D. Almost all kids are going to need a source of omega 3s because, I mean, seafood is not a huge part of a lot of kids' diets. Most kids need more zinc and magnesium. So, and that's sort of the nutrients, like the vitamins and minerals we're talking about. But then we're talking about in terms of broader categories of foods. Remember that, I mean, there are more bacterial cells in and on us than human cells. And so we have to nourish our microbiome. And our microbiome, they're not just focused on what vitamins and minerals we're getting. What they need are these broader categories of, in my book, I call them microbiome champions, but your 3 Fs, your fiber, which less than 5% of US kids and adults get their daily recommended fiber. Phytonutrients, which it's a pH, but it sounds like an F. So phytonutrients, which is all the color, the polyphenols in our foods. And one study found that there are 8 in 10 Americans has a phytonutrient color gap in every single color. In some places in the States, on average in the United States, on any given day, if you took a poll, 1 in 2 kids doesn't have a single vegetable. Right. And then we have our fermented foods, which is, it's a whole category of foods that can increase microbiome diversity and function and reduce inflammation that most kids are not having enough of or at all. And so focusing on all of those. And that's actually why, for the past 3 years, trying to think about, okay, we know our kids have these nutritional gaps. And then I was thinking, yeah, but they also have all of these microbiome gaps. I mean, they have all of these, like they need so much. And it's not just about what they need, it's about what their microbiome needs if we're really going to optimize their health. And so I actually spent 3 years making a supplement for kids to help fill all of their nutritional gaps with a full multivitamin, multi-mineral mix, and also their microbiome gaps with clinically backed, pediatric studied prebiotics. And there's a fermented fruit blend and, 30 plus organic fruits, vegetables, phytonutrients. So I think, if you can piece it together by finding a high quality kids multivitamin, multi-mineral, which is hard to find. You want to have your methylated Bs. You
Yep.
want to make sure there's a source of choline, which is important for brains. You want the activated forms of the vitamins like, B6 ideally would be in the, P5P form. So just being a little savvy about that, not just getting the gummy vitamin off the shelf, right? Because that may be doing more harm than any good. Then making always food is first. So working on that in your kids' diets. And then sometimes they need a little extra assurance.
Yes. So, as we're signing off, I'd say please look up Dr. Song. I know your website's down a little bit right now, but Healthy Kids, Happy Kids, or did I get
Yep,
it back?
healthykidshappykids.com. We're down temporarily and it should be up. Fingers crossed in like today.
Fantastic. Good. I know there's so many great resources on that site. I've used it for years and years and years.
Thank you.
As she just mentioned, really amazing supplements, like she said, and they're the active forms. There's so much research behind them. So you may want to go grab your Flintstone vitamins, but as Dr. Song said, that could be doing some more harm than good. So, and we've given you a lot of information. Please look at her book, right? Because this could be a 5-hour conversation. We can't fit it all in our little hour here. So please pick up a copy of her book. It's very well written, very easy to understand and to follow. And yeah, if they have any questions on the website when that's back up, will they be able to? Do you have a source for questions and stuff?
Yeah, there's a contact form on the page. The best place to get more up to date information from me too is on Instagram, which is healthykids_happykids.
Well, again, I would love to chat with you for 4 more hours, but I know you've got to go fix all those beautiful children, or I shouldn't say fix, you're going to enhance their
Yeah.
wellness, right? So thanks everybody for listening. Hope you took away a lot of tidbits. I know I did. We'll see you on the next episode.